Welcome to Chelsea's Vocation. I'm Chelsea, and because I've raised two children on the autism spectrum into adulthood, I can't help but smile when I recognize autism in another human, especially a child. I've had the privilege as a parent professional to spend 2 decades studying this neurotype and learning how to better adapt my own behavior and the environment around autistic children to both encourage and foster their development. My hope through this podcast is that you might better understand how neurotypical people process your neurology if you're autistic, or how to do better yourself as someone who values autistic humans and your relationships with them. To be sure, I'm a lifelong learner. I expect us to learn lots of things from each other as we go along. But for these first 5 episodes, I'm going to let you know where I'm coming from. That way you can better decide whether Chelsea's Vocation is worth your time or not so much. Either way, I'm glad you're here now. Welcome back to Chelsea's Vocation, the podcast. This is the 4th episode, so this is the episode about my journey. Like most 20-somethings, I was swept up in the momentum of adulting, embarking with my husband on our respective careers, paying the bills, squeezing in visits with out-of-town family, and establishing ourselves in our community had us moving and shaking. Discovering we were pregnant with Justice had us shaking in a way no one is totally prepared for, but we were giddy. As I explained in that first episode, the introduction to the podcast and my family, I did the best I could to work my hybrid home and office public relations job until Justice, our firstborn, was 18 months old. By that time, we had noticed his developmental delays, and I became a full-time stay-at-home mom. By the time Justice was 2.5, our youngest, Noe, was born. Really, the next 3 years would be a blur to me. The flurry of hormones and emotions and doctor visits and therapy appointments and buying a house were absolutely overwhelming to me. Later, I would learn about Jenny Wright's 7 stages of grief, and that really seemed applicable to my evolution as my kid's parent. So I'm going to use that as a framework for kind of what happened to me over the next few years and how I got to the point that I'm at today as a parent. I want to kind of put a disclaimer in here about these 7 stages of grief. I want to make it clear that not everything about being a parent of a child with a disability or with autism equates to being in a stage of grief. This sounds extreme, but again, I'm just using it kind of as a framework. And in these 7 stages, you'll notice it gets to a point where everything feels really healthy and moving forward. So I'm not saying that this is everyone's journey. I'm saying that this is my experience. And certainly along the way of meeting other families on this journey, I think a lot of us have felt some of these similar feelings. So I'm just going to go through them as per my experience. So the first stage is shock and denial. If you listen to the first episode, there was a winding path to Justice's autism diagnosis that kept me in a fog for a while, especially since I had some cognitive dissonance between what I thought autism was and what I knew about it and who I thought my son was. It just didn't seem to gel for me. It didn't really seem to make sense. What I really thought later on was I had a lot of unidentified ableist thoughts, and that prevented me from coming to terms right away with Justice being autistic. So that definitely held me back from moving forward. Then there's the pain and guilt stage. I thought about everything during this stage. I thought about my pregnancy. I thought about our birth experience. I thought about Justice's vaccination schedule and what we did or didn't do as parents during his infancy and his toddler years. I was heaping a lot of guilt on myself. I was feeling a lot of pain for what did or didn't happen. And it didn't help that a lot of people would come along when you're in this stage who don't know much about autism themselves, and they question you too. That was especially painful for me as a parent because I felt like we weren't really aligned between my husband and I. We weren't really aligned between the people who had been in our community up until this point. So I felt really alone in here in this pain and guilt stage. The next stage is anger and bargaining. I was looking for someone to blame for a minute. I think when you decide to stop blaming yourself, which is not helpful, I don't recommend it, that you start looking for someone else to blame. There must be someone at fault here. I even got to the point where I had called the pediatrician's office and I had asked the nurse about how many micrograms of mercury were in the vaccines that my kids got as babies and toddlers. It gave me something to do for a while, I think, while I was waiting for all of the hoops I had to jump through and the paperwork I had to fill out and submit and the waiting list that I was on to get Justice qualified for Medicaid and into some therapy. This anger and bargaining stage created kind of this fire in my belly, which was misplaced at times, but it did kind of help me develop that thick skin I think you need as a parent, especially if you're the parent of a neurospicy kid. You're going to get a lot of comments from people who look at your child's behavior and assume that that behavior is chosen. And you'll realize later that it's neurologically driven. I wish I had realized that sooner. But I think that fire in your belly that you get for moments like that ends up becoming helpful, believe it or not. Not that you want to be angry all the time. There certainly was a time that I was looking for a fight, right? You just get like that mama bear kind of vibe and you're just looking for someone to take out some of your frustration on. Also not healthy. The next phase is depression, reflection, and loneliness. There is a quote, Theodore Roosevelt said, "Comparison is the thief of joy." And I think in this stage, I was unintentionally comparing my kids to my friends' kids or their classmates. I might have been comparing our family's experience to other families' experiences. In fact, I remember for a long time really hating Christmas cards from people who coordinated their families' outfits and had everyone looking at the camera when I had the kind of family who, like, if I could manage to get us all in clothes at some point at the same time, that was miraculous enough. Sometimes seeing social media posts of families going on these vacations where everyone's able to stay together and have these shared experiences, that's just not how we were doing life. And so that can cause some of that depression. And depression is in air quotes. It's not a depression, at least for me, that was a diagnosable depression, but it, made you feel sad. It got you really reflective. It made you feel kind of lonely. I ended up kind of cocooning our family for a while, feeling like we didn't really fit the model of what was out there in the community. We didn't really fit the model of what was going on with families that we were growing up with. And so we just kind of stayed to ourselves. Somewhere in this time, I read Emily Pearl Kingsley's Welcome to Holland poem, which if you're the parent of a child with a disability, you might have read at some point. And at first it was lovely, but there's a line in that poem that convinced me for a while that pain would always be part of parenting my kids, which it really isn't. That does not need to be part of your experience. Of course, if you feel pain for a time, that makes sense, but that pain doesn't serve. It certainly wasn't serving me, and so it was good to shed that eventually. The next stage, this is where it started to get really positive for me, is this upward turn. You learn to breathe again, or at least I did. If you've been on a plane before, when they say put your oxygen mask on, parents, before you help your children with theirs in case of an emergency. And in order to learn how to breathe, you have to find your oxygen mask. I think there was a long time there where I just completely forgot about self-care, forgot about breathing through situations myself. So I really reminded myself I knew who my son Justice was better than anyone else did. There were a lot of people who were experts along the way, so-called experts, I would say, and they certainly might have been experts in their field, but they weren't experts on living with Justice and understanding who he was. So knowing that I knew him better than anyone else, I was the expert here, that kind of empowered me to become the parent that Justice needed and deserved. And I think this is where I started to kind of assume this mama bear persona. I really got to a point where I felt like I'm in this for the long haul, right? There are medical professionals and therapists on this team who are going to come and go, but I am going to be the constant. I took that role pretty seriously. I think this is really what catalyzed the upward turn for me in a defined moment kind of way. Justice had had an episode of rhabdomyolysis. We didn't really know that that's what it was at the time, but Justice had some muscle weakness in his legs. We weren't sure what caused it. At the time, his pediatrician believed that he had Guillain-Barré syndrome, which really is a progressive paralysis that moves from the limbs inward. And I was going to have to take Justice to our children's hospital. He was going to be admitted because the concern was that if this paralysis moved in toward his internal organs, specifically his lungs, he would stop breathing and he would need to be intubated simply to exist. I started to pack this bag to be able to stay at Children's, not knowing how long we were going to be there, quite frankly. And this is going to sound probably a little hokey to some people, but I really felt as I was packing like God said a little something to my heart. And he said, you know, Chelsea, your kids are going to go through some stuff, and you are not responsible for their health or their happiness, but their holiness. And that's not to say that I was trying to make my kids perfect, but the definition of holiness is set apart. And I guess what this moment really came to mean for me is that God's got these kids. God's the one who made these kids. They have been created on purpose for a purpose. So he's with Justice, he's with me. And I actually had a t-shirt in my dresser that said, God, help me to remember that nothing is going to happen today that you and I can't handle together. And I put it on and I went to that hospital. And I think that honestly, even though that night could have been Justice's last, I realized that we're going to be okay. Whatever happens here, we're going to be okay as a family, and not just in this moment, but going forward, because I really felt like God was with us on this journey. From that moment on, it felt so palpable to me. So the next stage is reconstruction and working through. I started doing this kind of reconstruction and working through by understanding Medicaid eligibility and funding. That was a really big part of having an intervention for autism. I don't necessarily think parents need to pursue interventions for their kids. I certainly have a different appreciation of neuroaffirming care now than I did when my children were young. But I know when we received a diagnosis of autism and I started to appreciate what that meant, and I started to do research on the outcomes for people with autism, which in the early 2000s were really grim. It really was not a hopeful outcome at all. I at least felt this need as a parent to do something. And part of that was going to be applied behavior analysis, which was an expensive therapy that was many hours per week. To be able to afford that, it was important to get an eligibility determination, a disability determination to qualify for Medicaid funding. So working through that was part of my reconstruction. And even understanding special education law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. I remember as Justice was transitioning from birth to 3 to early childhood, he needed an individualized education plan, and that was something that was always accompanied by your rights as a parent of a child with special education needs. So I started to kind of skill up on that and get a little bit better about becoming the kind of parent I wanted to be for my son and how I wanted to show up at those IEP meetings. Part of that was also putting together these binders. I think I mentioned that in a previous episode. I had all of these binders that I put together for each kid. Each kid had their own 3-ring binder with medical information or developmental information, and then another one for education. We would kind of keep these things going with these color-coded tabs for their coexisting conditions. That helped me to be able, in that reconstruction and working through process, to kind of be the expert who was in charge of coordinating these teams. I talked a little bit about that American Academy of Pediatrics medical home model. Binders are what I use to kind of keep myself together. While I was doing the research to understand the terminology that was in the information that I was provided as these kids were diagnosed with various things, and as I learned how to be better versed in coordinating and starting to put some of the pieces of these things together. The great thing about Reconstruction and working through for me is even though I was an English major in college, I didn't understand any of the science things. My husband, Pete, is a microbiologist. When he was in college, he was studying biology and microbiology and chemistry. When I was doing some of the research on these things, and of course, in the early 2000s, the so-called causes for autism or interventions for autism were loose and not well researched and everywhere. And I had a hard time sometimes sifting through that. Being able to run some of these things by Pete was so helpful for me to rule in what might be useful to pursue and what is just silly and kind of snake oil, and leave that behind. The last stage is acceptance and hope. This is really where neuroaffirmation happens. It's when you really understand that it is, of course, perfectly acceptable that your child has a different neurotype and that you are not looking to do things that change who they are, but instead to help them be the best them that they can be. And then you've got hope, right? So instead of being sucked into all the negativity that's available in the media, on the internet, wherever you're doing your research, the books that you're reading, you realize that nobody knows what their kid's future is going to look like, whether they have the same neurotype you do or they don't. So you just kind of learn to take it a day at a time. I was recently talking with a friend, and she gave some great advice to a parent of a younger child on the autism spectrum. They're like, don't look more than 5 years ahead, because you don't know what the future is going to hold. You don't know how your child is going to change, how the landscape of what we do about different neurotypes is going to change. So really, just don't look past that 5-year mark. And I thought that was really good advice. I think this acceptance and hope phase is where I wish I would have gotten to sooner. I don't expect anyone to be there immediately, although I will say I think society has come a long way with making us understand that there is nothing wrong with a neurotype other than neuronormative, right? We can come to an understanding now that all neurotypes are valid. They're all part of the human experience. Hopefully people aren't going through these grief cycles in such a profound way anymore. That would be wonderful. I hope that is true. Another thing I want to say, especially for me, that these stages are not a linear progression. You might have experienced these stages a little bit differently. You might meet someone who's in a different one of these stages. And I'll say, in my instance, there might have been events along the way that caused me to regress and go back to a stage that I'd already gone through. For example, when Justice was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, he had been hospitalized with some manic behavior. And through a positive family history of that mental health issue, he was diagnosed really young with bipolar disorder. And that, to me, was another blow. It caused me to kind of regress in how I was perceiving Justice's outcome and how we were going to cope as a family. Or if Justice had, for example, a big meltdown in public, as a parent, it would make me feel like an absolute failure. So I would go back to this pain and guilt stage. How do I not know him well enough that I can take him out into a space and he would become so dysregulated that it would elicit stares from other people? I don't think, though, each time I might have regressed, I didn't stay there as long as I was previously. I got much more efficient at returning to that upward turn stage and being able to, again, remember God's got them, God's got me. We can do this together. We're going to be okay. I am so thankful for the way that I have evolved as a parent, going from some of that kind of warrior, ready to fight mentality to assuming everybody on Justice's team has great intentions and that they're doing the best they can with the information they have and the resources that they have. And I too am doing the best that I have with the information and resources that I have at that time. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope some of this has resonated with you today. If this could help somebody else you know who's on this journey, please feel free to share it with them. I hope you come back for the next episode where Pete's going to share some information about his journey as a dad of 2 kids who are neurospicy. Thanks for tuning into Chelsea's Vocation today. Take good care.